right. We are live now. Sinthujan, is there a very strict lockdown where you are? Like you're in Berlin, right? So,
Yeah, I mean, I think nominally yes, but actually in practice, not really.
okay,
What
okay.
about you?
We're pretty all right now. I mean, it seems quite normal as such because
Hmm.
we're able to go out and do a lot of things at the moment.
Right.
Even though uh, with the rising number of cases, one does have to be definitely careful.
Hmm. How are the cases over there?
They're rising, also with the second mutant in play in some other cities at the moment. It's a bit of a scare for sure. But here we are, virtually all hanging out with each
I
other,
know.
trying to figure out our time differences and
I mean,
Yeah,
the numbers are pretty bad as well, but I think it's all relative, right? Like when you think about how it's worse in other places, I think
yes.
it's okay. Yeah. How about in New York?
um, yeah, it's people here are crazy. People are acting as if the pandemic is over.
Hmm.
There are very few people. I mean, now with vaccines coming in, brunch spots are up, people are out gathering, and I've been inside for almost a year, and
Wow.
I'm going mad. But it feels like people feel, I don't know. It feels like it doesn't feel like it's a pandemic. It doesn't feel like we are social distancing.
Yeah.
So
I think the
indoor
vaccination
dining is open. Huh?
isn't the vaccination rate in New York really high?
It is. They've vaccinated more people now. They made anyone about 30 now to be qualified. So yeah, they're doing a much better job of this.
Hmm.
But again, the people who are getting vaccinated are it's the same. You can see the class, race difference.
Yeah.
New York is a working city. It's a city made by working people, but working people don't own property here.
Hmm.
Similarly, in terms of vaccinations, it's predominantly people with resources, with money. Um, it's just yeah. And there are mutual networks that are really working hard to get vaccines, but it's I tried getting vaccines for everybody on the doorman in my building,
Hmm.
and it's a nightmare. If you don't have access to internet, surprisingly, a lot of people don't.
Hmm.
It's the black and brown communities that are not getting. I mean, the working communities across the board are not getting. So it's the same.
It's the same in London, right? Like the vaccination rates are sort of high, but they're only high
Mm.
for white people, white middle class people, and beyond that, it just skips out on everyone. And I think also like people are, I think a lot of like racialized people are also a little bit hesitant because of
Yeah.
histories of like misuse and abuse and colonialism, this that, right?
Yeah.
So you've got all the components coming together.
Yeah. Also, the Johnson and Johnson vaccine now is supposed to be more dangerous for women, but it's interesting that it's um yeah, they're like, oh no, it's okay. And again, surprisingly, it's going to affect. So yeah, if it's women, if it's again, it's
Mm.
interesting to see which bodies, which are the communities whose life matters, even when
Mm.
they talk about. So they didn't even think that this could. There's also a gender divide, there's a race divide. There is, yeah. So
It's the same in Denmark. I think they start because they stopped to entirely use AstraZeneca,
yeah,
um, which I think is worthwhile. But I think it of course slows down the entire vaccination drive. Right?
yeah.
And I feel like here in Europe, like in the EU, they've mismanaged. I mean, comparatively, right? I think that whenever you put everything in a global dimension, you feel like even your mismanagement is still a monopoly and a hierarchy that is not in favor of everyone else. So whatever complaints we make here are still disproportionately privileged, and it's just depressing. It's really depressing. Even like to think that while people are whining about or complaining about 12% of the population having their first vaccine, you're just like, well, that's not great. But I think it's even more terrible than other places. There's not even like 1%, vaccination rate. So
Yeah, so the emotions are angry, depressed. I'm going to burn everything down. The third, I usually try not to say out live, especially on the webinar about to start. But
Yes,
Rishi,
it's
we'll
good.
kind of transfer over to you. Whenever you're ready, we can kickstart this.
Yes, I was just about to say good evening to everyone. You are just getting to hear a little behind the scenes conversation. We were all catching up from different parts of the world. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're just letting everybody join in, and we thought we'll catch up on the status of vaccines and who gets the vaccine and which vaccine is working where. So I hope everybody's doing fine in their respective corners. Uh, it's great that at least virtually we're all able to be connected. Uh, yeah, just waiting another maybe minute or so and then we can get started. Uh, Meanwhile, I'll just quickly do a quick round of introduction. So, thank you everyone once again for joining this evening. This is the second talk of a four-part series that Suchitra Vijayan has come forward with, and we're very excited to be able to host this with her and some prolific speakers and writers and artists. This thought about this four series talks came about from Suchitra's recent book, Midnight's Borders, A People's History of Modern India, mainly as a point of departure to have the conversations return to the very fundamental question of representation. Who gets to document and describe our social worlds? How do communities in resistance use photographs, media, and video to challenge the powerful? How do we locate questions of ethics within this discourse of representation? And many, many more such questions that will emerge out of the talk today. And today we are very glad to have with us Sinthujan Varatharajah from Berlin. Sinthujan is a political geographer, essayist, and researcher. Their work focuses on geographies of displacement and statelessness. And in this conversation, they will discuss the relationship between spatial politics, geographies of power, and statelessness. So, without taking much of everybody's time today, I hand over the conversation to Suchitra and Sinthujan. Thank you so much for being with us. And I would also, just before we begin, I would also really like to thank Photo South Asia for making all these conversations possible. It's great to have everyone together. Over to you guys.
Suchi, thank you so much for putting this together, being being courageous enough to kind of, and also being a bit of a partner in crime, kind of curating a series like this, because as you know, it's never easy to bring together these difficult conversations, but also bring some remarkable folks that I've been following and learning from for a really long time. Suchi's already given a wonderful introduction to Sinthujan's work, but I also kind of want to add a little bit more. Is that I discovered Sinthujan's work through another phenomenal magazine, Funambulist, a few years ago. And since then, I've been following, learning from, but also, deeply fascinated by the kind of arguments, the works, the curatorial work, the writing, the ways in which Sinthujan uses not just the testimonies and stories, critical pedagogy, but also how those work with images, putting together various projects. So I'm really glad that Sinthujan is here joining us today, and I'm so glad that we're having this conversation.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for organizing this series and being part of it.
Sinthujan, I want to start before I definitely one of the things I want to talk today, and I'll definitely go a bit more into the Affect Archive, the project that you put together. But before we go into that, I really want to start by having the first question out to you about your own reflections on ideas of representation. Who gets to represent the world? And especially in your work, given that you deal with communities, especially the Tamil Elam communities and the Tamil refugee communities that not only go through multiple migrations, but what happens once they leave, ways in which these bodies are policed in Europe. talk to us about your own reflections on representation.
Sure.
And also, I know that I definitely urge others who are joining us today is to also look up a lot of Sinthujan's work on how you talk about racism, racial capitalism, white supremacy, and representation. But let's start with your initial reflections on your own work and how you've thought about these issues.
I mean, great question, first of all, and also difficult question. I think if I look at it from a kind of evolutionary point of view of how from the very beginning of the exodus of Ulam Tamil refugees from Sri Lanka and Ulam, I think for the most part, it was always like a third person kind of perspective on what was happening, you know, and there was a necessity and a need for many years to kind of like change the perspective and the narrative, but also like the angle of how we look at things. But for the most part, there were very few initiatives, you know, where people were actually like visually working and narratively working with these histories from a self kind of like centered point of view. So a lot of times we experience, you know, like outside documentation, outside kind of like writing, you know, journalism, and I think the Tamil community has, like the Ulam Tamil community has, from a very early point on, been quite shaped by the invisibility, you know, like that forced and curated invisibility. So even when you think about like Ulam Tamil resistance, and you think about the LTTE, and you think about how in the late 80s they started to set up a media apparatus, you know, quite a sophisticated, especially for that time being, you know, to document the crimes that were committed, but also like to document the insurgency, you know, like the war resistance efforts, in a way to create a kind of like an archive of propaganda, but also a documentation that showed and visualized the things that the news wouldn't cover. And I think having seen and having been part of that culture, I think it was a natural drive, especially for someone who's grown up in that environment, to also like think about how we talk about our current geographies, our geographies of displacement, and represent them in a way that actually centers the very people who have been affected, and to take away especially like the outside gaze, you know, like I think the gaze that we have for the most part been confronted with has been Sinhala gaze, an Indian gaze, but also like a white gaze. So there's like these multiple gazes that we had to negotiate and work with, and in many ways also like to be smart about in order to get our narratives out. So a lot of people and a lot of us are really deeply attuned to kind of cater to those power dynamics that are always kind of like against us. But I think there has been, in the last few years, maybe a few decades even now, there has been a drive, especially by younger folks, you know, who have been tech savvy, who have used, who also have a certain kind of like time, but also like physical distance from some of these forms of violence, to be able to kind of like take the time, reflect, you know, like the circumstances, and then to come up with solutions to change some of the overall power dynamics, which I think I'm also part of, you know, in the sense that I have been kind of like reverting a lot of the things and working through a lot of like historical kind of like documents and archives to understand archives that don't exist really, you know, like which you really have to create and build to create a kind of like visual representation or also like history of our people. And my work specifically doesn't focus on Ulam Tamil people in Ulam, you know, like I don't think that is my place or my space to begin with, you know. My work is very much based within exile, and that is the focus that I have in my work.
I kind of want to I have a follow-up question before we go talk about the Affect Archive. You talked about a curated invisibility, right? And that's a very interesting phrase, curated invisibility. And you talked about three different gaze: the Sinhala gaze, the Indian gaze, and of course, the white gaze. When I know that you started kind of tracing these histories in terms of timeline around 2012, 2013, talk to us about working against this gaze, because I'm sure that when you started putting these in these conversations, these testimonies, these objects that you found, talk to us about that moment of working against this gaze, because you're not only setting a narrative and your own archive, but a big part of this assembling this archive is also working against these cases, if I'm not mistaken.
No, you're not mistaken at all. I think what you realize quite early on is that you're being challenged. You're being challenged by many different actors and stakeholders. And I think it starts within those the very own community, you know, because a lot of times there's a mistrust in terms of like an understanding of how power works, and therefore questioning, you know, like your own relation to power and your ability to kind of like forward a history or to forward a narrative, you know. And then of course you have to you're being challenged by the status quo, and you're challenging the status quo too. So in that sense, you quickly realize there's a lot of like dismissal, there's a lot of like rejection, but also yeah, people questioning your objectivity, you know, so-called objectivity, and your neutrality in how you set the narrative. And in many ways, that is what I face from different stakeholders. You know, I don't have so much experience with the Indian gaze in terms of like directly, you know, because I'm based in Europe, you know, so most of it is either like the white gaze or the Sinhala gaze, you know. And I think in many ways something that I have very quickly been challenged, and what I've experienced as a challenge was to establish something completely outside of everyone else's stories, you know, and of everyone else's focus on how to tell these stories. So in 2013, I started this project, Roots of Diaspora, which was a Facebook-based project, you know. So we tried to, like, one of the things that I'm really particular about is I like to use the everyday means that people actually use, you know, and to take these methodologically kind of like more difficult research work into away from the academia and away from kind of like places that are paywalled or that are, you know, like that are difficult to access, to where people actually engage, you know, and where they for free can kind of like click on them. So what we did was to we built an archive of actually like telling single stories of people's flight routes, you know. So we're trying to trace how people left the country, what their memories were, but in a quite personal way, you know, like to go away from like destinations, you know, and to go away from the narrative of when did you get your citizenship or when did you leave the country, but actually like what were your last memories, what was the last food you ate, what did you pack, and with what intention did you pack, how did you communicate with your relatives, you know, while you were fleeing and when you arrived, you know, and how do you, and one of the questions that I was really interested in was, how do you relate to the identity of a refugee? You know, like, do you yourself ascribe that identity to yourself, or do you reject that at a certain point, you know? And I think that is something that I have not seen done from a lot of outsiders, because I think the focus is that there's already like a scheme of certain parameters. Once they're fulfilled, it's difficult to get outside of them. And depending on the political climate, you really see how you're just framed, you know. And my interest is in actually like giving our own communities the framing back. And that's something that I also have experienced. I mean, like, I also, you know, grew up in a refugee camp. My family fled as well. And from the age of 1, you know, I was already framed in a German movie on refugees, you know. Then in the media framing, they were already like putting together a narrative and a spin that suited them. But the question wasn't asked whether, is that how we see ourselves, you know, and is that the kind of representation, whether visual or orally or narratively, that we want to see, you know, of ourselves.
And that kind of brings us to the project that you worked on, the Affect Archive. In this, you did installations. This documents, as you spoke about, the Tamil refugee community's immigration to Berlin following the violence in Sri Lanka. But you also talk about ways in which this community that has fled a very particular violence then confronts the Berlin Wall, how they see the Berlin Wall. And this, again, I was again, thank you so much for kind of curating and putting this project together. You have maps, you have extensive testimonies, you have interviews, there are travel articles, there are historical informations. The question I have a series of questions on this project, and I have a feeling that we can have an entire day or weeks on this project if as these conversations go. But for me, what was interesting is that when I worked on my book, I had to kind of figure out a way to put all of this together on a text medium. Talk to us about how you put this together, because it was not one medium. You were trying to bring various objects together. How did you assemble this installation, this archive? And I also understand that as this travels from an installation to a book to other things, it'll change. So I would love to hear about the process of how you curated this, but also how you assembled this material together.
I mean, so far I'm mostly used to using digital kind of media, to curate these things. So I'm not very experienced with working within a physical space. So it was quite a challenge to actually like translate that and to understand how to, like to occupy a space. And I think that I found an interesting kind of aspect, especially because we're so not used to being able to occupy a space. Like all our lives, we're being deprived of spaces, and the physical space is what we lack of everywhere, and that control over a physical space. So I found it quite interesting to somehow be given a space a temporary space, because it was, like for the time being of the Biennale, but at the same time, it was something that we didn't have yet, sadly. Unfortunately, that was like the first encounter in Germany, like where we were able to, from an institution where I was able to work within powerful structures and to hold on a space, and then be given that opportunity. So I thought of it as quite a challenge, but also quite an opportunity, and in that sense, I worked together with a team of curators, who were curating last year's Berlin Biennale, who helped me in many ways to actually literally like physically think about what options I have. And of course you work within a certain budget, so you have some budgetary kind of like boundaries and limits which you're faced with, which then oftentimes like break down all your imaginary ideas of how a space like could translate into and become manifest. But what I'm really interested in, and what I've always been very interested in, was maps. Like how do you map displacement, and how do you map dispersal? Like something that I from like since 10 years I've been thinking about, like, or even longer, but I probably didn't have the means to kind of like imagine it in that sense, and to verbalize it that in that way, was to how does it, like the emotional map of a displaced family look like? Like how do they see the world? What do nation states and places really mean for them? And how do they engage, with borders, with passports, visas, all these regulations, So in that sense, maps were something that I was really central in. It was central in my idea of making this space work, so one of the things that I was really keen on is having an actual physical map of divided Berlin, which is the centerpiece of that archive, but then to also like to create several maps that are not just the map that you look on, but actually understand that the space is a map, but also the body is also a map. So one of the things we were doing in the exhibition space was to actually like draw movements, movements through the city, and recreate these movements through the exhibition visitors movement through that space. So we created stations in which we used the everyday infrastructural points of divided Berlin, through which refugees, Tamil refugees and other refugees too pass through to get from East Berlin to West Berlin, but to kind of make it into a lived experience by matter of the viewers and the visitors actually like retracing these through their own footsteps, and in that sense, I wanted to make it into a more interactive kind of engaging space, which was really living, in the sense that there were no boundaries in terms of like, you were allowed to touch the objects, you were allowed to kind of feel them, to understand that these are living matters, and that the archive, it doesn't need to be a museum, the archive is below your bed. The archive is in your cupboards, it's your everyday life, it's the clothes that you assemble or that you have, it's the photos that you have, it's the books that you collect, and that I found interesting, because in many ways what we're doing was also contrary to our own understanding of ourselves, because a lot of times people who live in exile think that history ends in exile. History is only confined to the place where they came from. Nothing that happens here has a meaning. It's just in relation to that place you left. Therefore, we don't assemble these, dates, these events, these experiences, these feelings, and think of them as valuable. Neither we who are exiled do so, nor the people who are not exiled, who still live in the homeland. So in that sense, I felt by doing this, it was like it was a challenge in terms of also understanding that we too have history. And I think for me, the way of how I curated that space, it was predominantly and mainly curated for a Tamil audience, even though the Tamil audience was a fringe audience. It was a very small number, relatively small number. For me, it was much more important to understand and to think about, reflect about how an Ilan Tamil person who has fled that country and has arrived here and has probably also gone through those movements through the city feels when going through that space. In that sense, something that I was really very cognizant and sensitive about is the placement of Tamil language. Like where do we put the Tamil language? And especially like in the context of Sri Lanka, as you probably know, language has been at the core of discrimination, of exclusion, of violence, So Tamil language, even to hear Tamil, means something so different, and even speaking Tamil in public is an act of resistance in many ways. And for many years, it was a threat, and it still is, depending on how things shift in Sri Lanka. So to place Tamil somewhere and make that experience an experience that is very specific, that doesn't try to be, it tells you a very broader story, a story that many people can relate to, like reflect on, but also feel something about, and see themselves in. But for me, I like to work with the specific and, breach out from the very specific to a wider kind of audience and theme.
Is it right to say that your core audience always is the Tamils who are in exile?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah, it is not a very capital oriented or an audience with which you can really earn much or do much in those sense. But I think in my practice, I think that has been like the guideline, like how do I reflect upon, our own needs, but our own realities, and how do I uplift our own, like communities, and that is something that I also tried to do within the exhibition, but which I generally try to do, especially because it's not necessarily a cause or a community or history that is very relevant to many people, unfortunately. So in that sense, it's not a popular, cause célèbre. It's nothing with which you can take up, like big stages. It's quite fringe, I'd say.
No, I think that's absolutely important. I think the other artist who does this is Nida Mehboob's work on Ahmadi community in Pakistan.
Mm-hmm.
And in one of her interviews, she actually says that I want this stories as a book that circulates within my community, and I want my community to use this book as a scrapbook.
Mm-hmm.
So she says it's not for Pakistani audience, it's not for us to, it's not my job to express to the majority oppressive community that my humanity is important. It's for my community to talk about how we're feeling. That really brings us to this idea of untold stories, right? What aspects of a story get untold, especially when a community is gone through resilience, resistance, violence. There are multiple histories, and you also talked about this briefly about how you remember, history ends with the exile, right? So, what stories don't get told in these stories of exile? For example, I never imagined that when a community leaves, they would have also encountered the Berlin Wall, because that was the social political reality of that. So when you were doing this project, talk to us about stories that you excavated that you never had any ideas about. Because even within the exile, not all stories and memories are protected, preserved, and passed on.
I think a lot of times we disremember, like how politically active, a lot of our communities have been, even in local fights. A lot of times we think about, like the only ways of how they've engaged politically was in the conflicts back home, but a lot of them have been at the forefront of anti-deportation, asylum rights, of making sure that human rights are being upheld locally as well. And I think in many ways, like in a German narrative, for instance, Ula Tamil people have been written out, even though in the 80s they've been at the very core of refugee discussions, like the position that Ula Tamil refugees have taken in refugee discourses is similar as to how Syrians have taken it in 2015. but somehow there has been this amnesia, and I think that amnesia is structural in the sense that there's a system behind, like even forgetting is political, right? And writing people outside of history is political, and that is something that has happened to our community, and I think about when I think about the Berlin Wall, something that I found really interesting about it is that I've been in consultation with Berlin museums, who were working on the Berlin Wall remembrance, and they've been talking about, like they've been interested in ideas of how to diversify narrations around the Berlin Wall. And if you've been to Berlin, you've probably seen there's a lot of like traces of the walls, a lot of like memorial kind of structures, but also museums dedicated to that. But one of the things that I found interesting is that, and that which I also told them in one of the consultant sessions, that the work you've done on the wall is brilliant. Like the museums you have are great. And I think it's impressive. But I think your approach is maybe difficult. Like the question you asked me are maybe wrongly directed. You asked me like, why do racialized people, marginalized people, why do they not, like more actively, proactively go into these museums? I think it won't happen by breaking up your exhibitions. They're great. I think it's about extending those and thinking about, like can a history be confined to a singular perspective? Or do we have to think about a history from different places, from different perspectives and different people? And I think that's what I tried to do within that exhibition, was to tell Berlin as a Tamil city. How do different people experience a city, and how is that reality never considered real? And the wall was very real, for many people in Eastern Berlin, but also Eastern Germany, but also like all other like Soviet kind of controlled states, and but whilst what I found, what I was thinking about, and what I was very curious about, is that we always talk about walls as impossibilities, as boundaries that kind of like lock in, people that are impossible to kind of, or difficult to surmount. But this wall actually was, whilst, locking up people, and it enabled people's movement, because there was a loophole, there was a legal loophole, and there was a physical loophole, which people who were neither part of the Cold War, like fractions, nor of the Western fractions, were able to use to their advantage. And this is where I bring in so-called third world refugees, how third world refugees were navigating through these two dogmatic systems and spaces, like to undermine these very boundaries, because this is precisely of how Ulan Tamil refugees did it, but also how Palestinian refugees did it, how Ghanaian refugees did it, how so many different people did it after them. But in Germany, for instance, the focus was on regulating Ulan Tamil refugees, because the numbers were so high and the bodies were so dark. And that was something that wasn't, it's still not part of the history books. And this I find interesting in the sense that it's not part of our own history books, because a lot of time when you think about Ulan Tamil exiled communities, you think about Toronto, you think about London, you think about, if you're prolific, maybe Sydney, you don't even think about people in Tamil Nadu, like their history doesn't exist. But also you don't think about people who are in the non-English speaking West. You don't think about people in Italy so much. You don't think about people in Germany so much, and I think the role that a country as Germany took back in the days was quite specific. Like nowadays, when you think about Germany in terms of refugees, you think of Germany is a place that everyone wants to be. Like Syrians wanted to come to Germany, which we found quite interesting, because we didn't want to come to Germany. Germany was just a country that was on the way to Canada, but a lot of us got stuck in Germany. And yet it is a country that has shaped so many of us, because most refugees from the 80s passed through this country. So they were shaped by this place, but they also shaped this place. And that the way of how they shaped this place has not been established.
Yeah, but also I've encountered Tamil refugees in Cairo. I've encountered them in Baghdad. I've encountered them in Cuba, which then shows you there are some very interesting histories of Tamil refugees who also made their way to Ethiopia. From Ethiopia, they then went with, there's another history in which Ethiopians also left Ethiopia for Cuba. And a lot of Tamil refugees were actually part of that history of fleeing or migrating. So that history is transnational.
Yeah, I think there's also like, I also find it interesting, like there was a case 2 years ago when Rohingya refugees arrived in Jaffna. You know, they arrived from Tamil Nadu in Jaffna, or even now you see Tigray refugees, you know, who go to refugee camps in Sudan, you know, and you have Eritrean refugees who are in the Tigray region, who then have to go from the Tigray region to Sudan. And you're just like, there's so many overlaps. And it makes you feel like all these places, they're one place is safer than the other, but they're all not safe. It's just like a lot of negotiations that are happening.
No, absolutely. I want to go to something. When I was preparing for this conversation, I'm going to read out something that you wrote.
Mm-hmm.
You say, when Appa picked my cousin, he committed a crime. He suddenly became a smuggler of an undocumented person, my cousin. Back then, my father, just as most other Tamils, and we were only legally tolerated in this country. Neither his precarious status, the constant fear of deportation, of racial profiling, and targeting of Tamil refugees through the so called Tamil regulations didn't prevent him to act against the law to decide in favor of the survival of our family. This is a story that I've heard, and at least for the book I've heard, when I read this, it felt like deja vu's, a million little stories dotted across so many stories of migration.
Mm-hmm.
This, I want to speak about this moment when people's act of simply just surviving, existing,
Mm-hmm.
demanding a fragment of dignity becomes criminalized.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me about this idea of criminalization. And you also made this thing where it said that we were too many bodies and we were too dark. Talk to
Mm-hmm.
me about this.
I think whenever I think like, I think criminalization starts for us in Sri Lanka, you know, like when you think about the Prevention of Terrorism Act in
Yeah.
1979, you know, which made it de facto legal to lynch, arbitrary arrest, torture, kill, you know, Tamil people at the beginning, mostly like Tamil cis men, you know, but then it shifted towards all Tamil people, you know, and that is something that has been a continuing kind of experience for Tamils, you know, like everywhere. So I think the way of how we think about legality and illegality is quite different, you know, like we're just like, even existing is illegal apparently. So something that my mother taught me was to, the fact that, you know, like us smiling, us, you know, like breathing, us, you know, like enjoying life is already an act of resistance, because there's so many forces that are trying to stifle that. So in that sense, I think when your bodies have been so criminalized in so many ways, at some point you become so numb, you know, like at some point you actually don't realize, you know, what is legal, what is illegal. You're just like, I'm just trying to do something, you know, like, and I remember like one of the first things that my mother did when she fled, you know, like like my parents, they fled separately, and my mother was in a different refugee camp than my father. And when you are assigned to refugee camps in Germany, you're not allowed to move to one to another without, you know, like permissions. And my mother didn't understand that, you know, she just arrived, she's like, well, I'm going to see my husband now. I haven't seen my husband, you know, like for months. And we've been separate for so long. I'm going to take a train, you know, and I'm going to go there. Once she left, you know, like the police were starting to search for her. Then there was this whole, you know, like investigation, you know, going on. And then when she arrived, she didn't know what was happening. Everyone was thought she was missing, something happened to her. And then she was forced to go back to the refugee camp she was assigned to. And she did not understand that. And my father did not understand it either, because she's my wife. Why would you put us in different camps? And that inhumanity, I think, it touches people, it hurts people, but it also creates a different type of people, people who are resilient, you know, like in a way that it doesn't show necessarily in a like, it won't lead them to go to a protest and do something, but it will lead them to actually resist in many different ways. Like when I think about my parents, I always think about how I sometimes think of them as much softer and much more, you know, like vulnerable, you know, than they are. Because in everyday situation, when I think about how they deal with authority, I'm just like, wow, they're much more resilient than I am. They're much more, you know, like fierce. They're much more, their tenacity is much higher to kind of like bear with everyday kind of like forms of violence. And I think that story of my father, you know, picking up my cousin, you know, and going against all legal regulation is also part of that. Like there was nothing, I think like what they were insisting on is their own humanity through all their acts. Even if the laws were set against them, they didn't care for it, because all they kept on saying is, this is inhuman and we're human. Like, why would you not, why would I not, why wouldn't it be of interest to me to help my family? You know, and it's the same that you see with refugees everywhere. You know, like when refugees give each other like, you know, like fake passports, when they give each other their names, you know, like when they lend each other's photos of each other, you know, and making sure that everyone is able to kind of like be secured and safeguarded. And I think this is, and also I think in when you think about it systemically, you think about how people are forced into lying, for instance, when they go through the refugee kind of like process, you know, of the asylum process. Most stories are not eligible to a refugee status, because the way of how a state frames violence is not how violence works. You know, they want you to have they want you to have a paper issued by the Taliban that says the Taliban wants to kill you. You know, this is the only way of how they would recognize how violence and threats function. But I think people, in a way, they're forced to constantly, like, you know, like break boundaries, negotiate them, and to in order to just live, and to, you know, like to sabotage a system that deprives them of their own humanity. And I think this is something that isn't just particular to the Ila Tamil community, but I think you see it across the board, as you were saying.
But also, as someone who was a lawyer and who did a lot of work on resettling refugee communities, the hardest part was often telling someone that first they had to provide footnotes for their lived experience, and then tell them that the fear that they carry within themselves is not good enough to, you know, um, give them, qualify them within the legal categories of when they've already gone through hell. Um,
I
I
did
now
work
want to,
sorry, I did work on refugees as well, you know, like in terms of like
yeah.
refugee cases as well in London. I accompanied a lot of like Ula Tamil refugees who arrived after 2009. It was a similar kind of like experience, you know, like you had to first of all like extract all that information, which was terrible in itself, because you had to like negotiate also things like gender, age, you know, like, and then language, but also like cultural sensitivities. You're just like, you know, when you ask for someone's experience of rape, you have to make sure that they understand that a cultural translation won't be sufficient. You know, like it will have to lead into you actually like jumping over your own customs of how you speak about such experiences to make it understandable. And even then, oftentimes it's not sufficient. So in that sense, it's a very frustrating and a very humiliating and violent experience.
Also, when it comes to questions of sexual violence,
Mm.
people don't often tell you those stories. Sometimes you'd
Exactly.
have to sit with a family. Sometimes you would get different. For example, I remember this family when we knew that this young boy could have been a victim of sexual violence. But when it was a family, the
Mm.
father, in front of the father, he would just not talk about it.
Exactly.
And once the father leaves, the mother then tries to make sense of it.
Mm.
But it took us about 5 or 6 or 7 conversations to finally even understand what he had experienced.
Mm.
And all of this is traumatic because you're also demanding people to narrate their trauma again in order to be respected with the sense of dignity. um, I want to should we talk about the ocean borders? Are we open to
Sure.
that?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. You also talked about we had this back and forth about the ocean borders, the ocean frontiers between Elam and Tamil Nadu. And it's also quite interesting that we are being hosted by the Chennai for a Biennale. Um, for instance, in my book, I very specifically left out the ocean frontiers, the Indian Ocean histories, especially the Tamil Elam history, because I felt that I needed a certain kind of one, I felt inadequate.
Mhm.
I felt I didn't have the enough historical. While I am Tamil, I'm not Elam Tamil. I'm Indian Tamil, and I would bring a very specific Indian gaze to this project.
Mhm.
So I left it out. But today, since you're here, I really want to talk about this ocean frontiers, this act of migration from the island to Tamil Nadu. Let's open it up and let's like I kind of want to hear from you what you think, and then we can kind of draw from that.
I mean, coming from an island community, I think the way of how we relate to the ocean and to the sea is quite specific, right? And one of the things that I'm really interested in it is to understand how conflict functions differently on islands, you know, how colonialism functions differently on islands, how dependencies work differently, but also how boundaries are negotiated differently, you know, and how borders, because a lot of times borders are only thought through, you know, like land masses, but never through very, you know, like very seldomly we talk about oceanic borders, you know, and I think that is a general focus that we have so much on land rather than sea, you know, and which is of course, you know, based with industrialization and infrastructural kind of developments and stuff and technology really. But yeah, I mean, like the border, and so that's something that I've thought about, you know, like read about, wrote about, you know, like in some ways or another, you know, and I think from an Ulan Tamil perspective, I think the way of how we understand nation state is quite different than a lot of like Indian Tamil people do, for instance, you know, like the way of how we challenge the nation state is quite different, you know, so in many ways, like we oftentimes get frustrated when people from Tamil Nadu are so neatly Indian, you know, like when they're
Well, not all of them, but
not all of them.
I get
Yeah.
I get what
You
you're
know,
saying.
but you understand of how the experiences we make on different shore ends and in different state structures can be so vastly different. And then the people who you know, like are the result of that, kind of like with the Kurds, you know, you realize they're so different depending on the systems they're subjugated to, you know, and we the way of how we understood Tamil Nadu is always quite different. We don't think of, when we think about Tamil Nadu, we don't think about India. We think about Tamil Nadu, you know, and we think about, you know, like how our grandparents used to be able to take a boat, you know, and to a ferry, you know, from Mannar to Rameshwaram, you know, or to Kachadi or somewhere else, you know, or to take a plane even, you know, to Trichy or somewhere else, and to independently in some ways or somewhat autonomously connect from one Tamil shore to the other Tamil shore. And all these attempts have been hampered by the Sri Lankan state, you know, in the 1970s, when they started to close the ferry lines, when they started to close the airport, you know, and to occupy the airport and to hinder and sabotage autonomous Ula Tamil movement to Tamil Nadu, you know, which in many ways then focused and brought the focus of people in the Northeast towards Colombo much more. So in a way, like the colonial state, the Colombo-based colonial state became a reality that didn't make logical sense. Because when you think about, you know, like for instance, like the miles between, or the kilometers between Jaffna and Mannar and the coasts of Tamil Nadu, it's between 30 to 60, you know. And the question I always ask, like when you go, for instance, on dating apps on Jaffna, in Jaffna, you don't end up in Colombo, you end up in Tamil Nadu. You know, like you swipe with people in Tamil Nadu, you know, you chat to people in Tamil Nadu. And I think about the ocean border and the oceanic experience from an Ula Tamil perspective as an experience of a lot of longing. You know, like we for a lot of us who were for many years not able to go back and who still aren't able to go back, what a lot of us do is to go to Tamil Nadu. You know, we go to Tamil Nadu, we go to Rameshwaram or somewhere in the south, you know, and we look down towards what assumingly is somewhat Elam, you know, and we imagine that place. And I think about it, for me, it's interesting because I think about it like Tamil Nadu people have such a different experience. And you see that in reporting, you know, like the reporting that we get is Tamil Nadu fishermen being arrested, you know, like being killed by the Sri Lankan army and so on, you know, and which is also very valid and very real experiences. But for us, we think of the ocean as an opportunity, but also an impossibility, because at some point that ocean line that connected us for so many centuries with Tamil Nadu, you know, which enabled so many migrations, so many kind of like interactions, you know, like cultural interactions and political interactions, you know, economic ones, that has been controlled by both Delhi and Colombo in ways that kind of prescribed and undermined a lot of like relationships that could exist outside of the nation state of India, but also outside of the nation state of Sri Lanka, you know, and therefore I think of the ocean almost as a traumatic kind of, you know, like state for a lot of people, you know, which we saw in the tsunami too, you know, like there's this relationship of, there's so much gratitude towards the ocean, so much um, worship as well, of the ocean. But then when you see the ocean, coming back with you with such violence in forms of the Sri Lankan Navy, but also in forms of the tsunami, you realize that even nature, what nature has given to you, can be controlled by people in such terrible ways. And I think a conflict that takes place on an island at some point runs out of land, and you realize it in 2009 when you saw how the Sri Lankan army was locking up, like Tamil people, like they came from the north, from the west, from the south, but also from the east. People were running from one end of the ocean line to the other. At some point in Mullaitivu and in Mullivaikkal, they ended up at the very end of that boundary line. And then there was only the ocean. People were standing in the water, seeing the Navy, like shelling from the Navy ships. Some people boarding, like boats and being shot, drowned, and some people ending up on boats that then led them to Tamil Nadu, where they ended up as refugees.
But it's also a certain kind of historical negation, right? I remember that when you go to, I grew up in Madras, or now renamed as Chennai.
Mm-hmm.
Chennai, even as an ocean city, still seemed very distant from, say, the down south, from Rameshwaram. And there's a lot of cultural history that kind of has been now erased, right? Because now Tamils who live in Tamil Nadu are now Indian, while the Elam community then becomes given a different name, so that we also lost that sense of history, food, culture, language, along with these things. I know we are close. I know that the time has run out, and we are close to the 1 hour mark. And I think there are a lot of questions coming in as well for you. So before we go into that, I really want to tie up all of these things. In terms of now representing communities, right? And geographies. But also the communities that you're writing about are communities that have gone through not only occupation of land, deprivation of land, but also militarization. Do you feel as a visual language? I feel this, but I'm also kind of asking if you feel a certain impasse when it comes to representing these geographies. When the Rohingya crisis happened, almost all photographs I saw of the Rohingyas coming out 2.5 years ago were photographs in black and white, completely. I forget the name of the process. The way the photographic process that makes black and whites look too sharp, too gritty. They were all photographs of bodies, just black and brown bodies, made even more darker in the photographic process. Or you saw images that were kind of almost titillating to a Western audience to say, oh my God, look at these heaving masses that are now moving. There's very little work that actually just deals with the act. Often you're turning the lens on those who have been taken away with everything. We're not on those responsible for it. In your own practice, do you feel that we are at an impasse when it comes to representing communities that go through acts of occupation, militarization? Talk to us about that.
I mean, I think so. I think it's very difficult to see, especially in established outlets, to see that kind of representation. I think when you think, I don't search for these, like visual kind of representations there anymore. For me, I think it's so uninteresting. When you think about who's taking these, who's getting these jobs, who's being paid for them, for what intention, and how are they being consumed. Like Alan Kurdi, is a good case, and how in the Syrian refugee crisis, how these images started circulating here as well. But I think when you look at the very communities themselves, you see quite a variety of different images coming out, and I think it's a matter of seeking these images and seeking these representations, but also like elevating them, bringing them on a different stage. And I think for us, one of the things that I think was a person who has been quite at the forefront of doing it without people actually really like giving her the credits has been MIA. And MIA's work has really elevated, has given actually just a visual, but also like a language, to a lot of things, and she used a lot of like different kind of like visual forms of representation, art, but also photography and even videos like the video Borders, where she used Ulan Tamil refugees in Tamil Nadu to talk about and to visualize and use, symbols, metaphors, in ways that we've not seen, and I think this is the future too, in many ways. And I think curation happens everywhere, like we all curate, even affected communities curate, a family curate, I curate myself, and therefore I think maybe seeking authenticity is not the right way of going about it, but to actually like find way, or allowing people to really like curate their own stories, and to carry them to a wider audience in their own means and ways, and in the visuals they want to see of themselves.
All right. So what I'll do is we have some interesting questions coming in. Should I read them out?
Sure.
Right. The first, so we have a question from David Shah, which asks you to talk about the affect archive. I'm thinking maybe we can go to the other questions and come back to the affect archive because we've already spoken quite a bit about it. The question I'm going to take is from Naseem, and Naseem says, you touched upon the idea of how the medium and forms that your archives has been curated to become is to be closer to common access, especially access for communities for whom this archive could be pertinent, away from academics paywalls as such. There was also this raised point of who you thought was your primary audience, which you clarified. But I was wondering how your conscious and possibly subconscious sense of who the audience and who you hope to would be the audience for this work affected your curation and direct decisions in terms of method, in terms of outreach, perhaps even in terms of participation. So the question is about how your audience then affects your curatorial practice of assembling things together. This is from Naseem.
I think you think about different kind of visual cultures too, right? Like the way of how a European kind of like understanding and lens and viewpoint on these things might differ, I think as someone who has grown up and has been raised in Europe, I think my aesthetics are quite European, so my question was, how do I make it still Tamil enough, but not, like in a way like forcefully Tamil, like I didn't want to speak to all, like ways of how a Tamil, like a Tamil community or a Tamil school or a Tamil, like community center would organize an exhibition. I want to speak about how could we mix these things together. And I think something that I, as I was saying before, found very interesting and very important was language, like even if the aesthetics might not necessarily like speak to a traditional Tamil aesthetic, I think the ways of making understandable in terms of like language, in terms of like audible audios, in terms of like videos, but also in terms of like texts, I think really enabled people to really relate to it, and I had a lot of like Tamil people like from actually like from different parts of the world, like send me congratulatory messages, to send me flowers, to send me like, like gifts and to comment on what that exhibition means to them just from images, like from images that were posted online, which I found interesting. These people never entered that space, but the meaning of an exhibition, and I think that I found quite interesting, is that the exhibition in itself wasn't at some point accessible because of Corona. When COVID-19 started, at some point we had to shift. We had to like close the doors for 3 months before we reopened, which was a period in which we were planning workshops with the Tamil school here, with Tamil elderly people, then with Tamil more like middle-aged students, to come in and to use that space and opportunity. And that is something we couldn't do. In that sense, we had to like negotiate these different boundaries. But I think the focus on a particular audience helps you to really like kind of stay concise, and to not lose your track, and to actually also appreciate and value their comments and their feedback in much different ways, right?
No, absolutely. I actually had a question for you in terms of two questions. You talked about, we already discussed this idea of how exiled communities look at history. But while you live in Germany, while you believe that your experiences are in Germany, you're also constantly viewing what's playing out in the island. You see the occupation, see the military violence, you see electoral processes playing out, you see draconian laws after another being played out. How do you then, from a point of exile, still, because that's still your home, that's still your community, how do you respond to that? And a follow-up to that is, I know you use a lot of the digital mediums as a way to reach people, but also now these mediums are not as democratic as one might assume. The Sri Lankan government, if I'm not mistaken, shut down a series of Facebook posts. They shut down a series of accounts. They are notoriously infamous for shutting down, demanding that Instagram accounts be shut down. If I'm not mistaken, people were arrested for Facebook posts and other things. How do you negotiate these two? One, viewing all of this playing out, but also as you respond to this moment, there is a certain kind of digital restriction that happens, and the state plays a role in controlling the narratives that you want to put out.
I think what we here do is like, I mean, a lot of our activism, our political work is lobbying work, you know. It's a lot of like ways of engaging kind of Western states and governments, you know, to critically act, you know, in regards to Sri Lanka and the Tamil community. And that is, I think, also in many ways also the limits of how much we can do politically from here, you know, like we can organize here, we can create visibility, you know, we can speak to these forms of violence and make sure that they reach a wider audience than we're inclined to elsewhere, you know, but also like to be able to support communities back home. I think a lot of the things that we do is to try and kind of like connect, you know, like with people there, you know, with organizing structures, with political kind of like organizations and human rights organizations to make sure that they're not just economically feasible and economically stable, but also to politically and socially and emotionally support them, and to make sure that like I mean, I am based in Germany, but I think our experiences are transnational. So we can't afford to just speak about a single context. Like we have to think about all these different contexts at once, because it's not just us who are, you know, like with like my own family is spread between 12 different countries. So technically I have to think about 12 different contexts because it really affects you, you know, and you have to constantly be aware of it. And in regards to the internet and the digital world, I think it's an increasingly, you know, like yeah, challenge that we've been facing. I mean, for many years, I think we've kind of like kind of like navigated it quite easily because restrictions have not been as harsh, you know, and you could create digital cemeteries, you could have, you know, like all types of different kinds of forms of expressions of self-determination, you know, but now there's so many more restrictions happening also here, you know, through, you know, like Instagram, you know, Facebook. You also see them through European or American laws being limited and restricted. So in that sense, I think all we can do is to outsmart these systems. Like one of the things that we're very dependent on technology because of the ways of how we're dispersed. And the only way of how, and I think refugees are one of the most innovative kind of like groups of people to use and push technology to a place where it hasn't been, and also what it wasn't, you know, like considered to be for, you know, and in many ways, like ways of how refugees use everyday technology then at some point becomes the norm. Like things like, for instance, through COVID-19, you've seen like funerals, you know, like being broadcasted on Zoom or Skype or on FaceTime, you know, like, and these are normal things for us. Like it's not just a corona experience. These are our lives. People put graduation ceremonies on Zoom. They put funerals on Zoom. They put everything. Like we have a death book, a virtual death book for all our community, in which everyone posts their relatives who die, so that other people who know them from a village back home see on the other end of the world who has died. So in that way, like we're so dependent on it, and therefore we're so vulnerable towards it too. And but all we can do, because we're so in many ways in a powerless position, somewhat powerless position, is to outsmart these systems, you know, like to change our vocabulary, to change our visual language. Like something I do, for instance, on Instagram, you can't use any like resistance symbols without it being flagged immediately, you know. So what I do is I put in emojis, you know, and for instance, I put in an emoji tiger, you know, because no one cares about that cute tiger, you know, but it's like everyday ways of challenging these things. And what I like to do is to actually like create guidelines to help other Tamil people use the internet in a way that doesn't criminalize us as much.
We have another question. It says, when you mentioned the quote, we were too many bodies and we were too dark. The I don't know what that means. is this a medical representation? The media representation of the global South came to my mind, in which do you think is the representation of certain populations as overpopulated problematic, especially in view of climate resource discourse, where for the most part Eurocentric perspectives are centered as sustainable and as the right way. I hope the question is understandable. I think it makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. And of course, they also say thank you for the wonderful inputs from both of you today. So, yeah. So the question is, do you think the overpopulated dark bodies is a very specific Eurocentric way of looking at these as overpopulated problematic populations, and especially in terms of climate discourse? You've heard Prince Philip, who recently died, say this. The Melinda Gates Foundation, for instance, actually believes that it's the brown and black women reproducing that is the biggest climate change, and they've been pushing for contraceptives on brown and black women. So this is not just an isolated view, right? The idea
Yeah.
that the problem is you and me reproducing, or people who look like you and me reproducing as a problem, it's been quite widespread. Can you talk to us about this?
I mean, of course, it's a very Eurocentric view, and I think the problem isn't that there are too many of us. I think the problem to me is more like, why do we live in a world in which we think it's normal that there are white people in Australia, or in Argentina, or in the US? I'm just like, if we spread these things, I'm just like, I mean, these are people of European descent. If we put them in relation, I think it's a lot of them. And the only difference is that they are not confined to a single state. Therefore, and this, I mean, even India, if you divide up India in all the states it should have been, like without, like British colonialism, then you wouldn't have a population of 1 point something billion people. No one speaks about Europe being, like almost 500 million people, and then Europe's diaspora in the US, in Canada, in Australia, in Southern America, like being so and so many hundreds of million people. If we all combine them together, I'm just like, I don't know who's more and why we need to, why we need to, because I think that the framework in itself is already skewed against us. When you think about a state like Nigeria, I'm just like, or Ethiopia, I mean, not Ethiopia, but Nigeria, I'm just like, it's huge. Of course, the population will be huge too, and I think in many ways, I think we're still, we're still confronted with a world that hasn't been empathetic towards our realities. And I think climate change, I think there was a study which said that European colonialism was the accelerator and the catalyst for a lot of climate change kind of effects that we're still facing with, and that are irreversible, and in that sense, I'm just like, where do we start that analysis? Do we look at it, from a current point of view on how much, the emission is of China, or of India, or do we think about, how historically, these, there has not been an equal kind of development, there's not been an equal kind of relationship to environment too. And I think, therefore, I hate these types of analysis, and I'm always like, and I think these sterilization policies, that we see from the Gates Foundation and stuff. I mean, these are all racist, colonial, and imperial kind of policies that have a long historical tradition, and that have, I mean, it roots back to that pathologization of Black and brown kind of populations, and I think that is the core issue. And I think if we revert all these things back and think about the world differently, then I think the problem isn't us being so many, but actually white people being everywhere, and everyone allowing white people to be in power, even in places where they are a minority.
Would you like to go back and talk about the Affect archive again? Because we have a question from David Shah that says, can you tell us a little bit more about the Affect archive project?
I mean, the Affect archive was part of the 11th Biennale, and there were different rounds. The Affect archives was an archive that I was sharing together with an Argentinian artist, and I think what we were trying to do is to actually in many ways, biennales oftentimes, they bring in a lot of international artists and international kind of renowned kind of personalities who speak about the globe, who speak in very globalized ways, but they oftentimes miss speaking about the place a biennale takes place in, right? And and my part was to actually like speak about that place this Biennale is in, you know, and my interest was to actually like to revert back into a more local global relationship, and not, you know, like global, you know, and then global somewhere local, you know, relationship. And I think in that way, I found it interesting because it was also placed in one of the most marginalized, poorest, racialized boroughs of Berlin, you know, and to have an exhibition of this scale, speaking about the reality of a population that is also marginal and that also lives in this area, you know, was, I think, something that I don't see many times, you know, in these types of institutions happening, you know. And in many ways, I think from the reactions of the audience, it was something that touched them. I don't think, like, for instance, like I never went in there saying I'm an artist, you know, I'm a researcher, you know, and I am visually, you know, like inclined, and that's how I work, you know. And for many people, this is not what they necessarily, even in an age of forensic architecture and whatsoever, it's nothing they're really attuned to, especially in a place like Germany, you know. And therefore I think it touched many people in ways that I didn't understand and that I didn't fathom, in, you know, like, but I think there was something that was approachable, you know, something that tangible, that people could relate to in many ways, but people could also think about history, and then connect it to the contemporary. Because the core of the question of this exhibition was, why, in a non-direct way, why do refugees today have to take boats? You know, when in the Mediterranean, for instance, you know, when they could take planes, and those flights would probably cost 20 euro, 40 euro, whilst, you know, like their deadly, you know, like boat rides cost 2,000 euro or 5,000 euro, you know, or a life, you know. And when you look at the policies that this exhibition was focusing on, it was focusing on the policy of, when did airlines become visa agents, you know, border controls? When did the airport, you know, like become a border as it is today, you know? And what did that mean for refugees? And because in Germany, these policies were played out on Tamil refugees, and Tamil refugees were that example used to limit refugees' access to this country, it was interesting because then people could think about a very marginal history that no one really, not even Tamil people know about it, you know, like, but a history, and then relate it back to why Syrians today, or Iraqis, or Afghanis, you know, like, die in the Mediterranean. And it made sense. And the interesting thing is, like, you just had to look on a map of Berlin, of this city that we stand in, to understand what is happening in the Indian Ocean, what is happening in the Mediterranean, what is happening, you know, in the Caribbean, you know. And then and that I found an interesting kind of way of going about this problem.
No, thank you so much for that. I think we're about 10 minutes off the timeline. Suchi, should we close it up, or are there more questions? I have a feeling that I might keep
You guys
asking
feel
Sinthujan questions all day long.
do you guys want to continue a bit, or do you
I feel
think
like I never answer your questions the way they should be answered. I feel like I'm always like going some other way.
No, I love, that's the thing about conversations, right? That you never know. Like, you never know where conversations go. It's you know, it's once a friend once said, I told him, I think about 5 years ago, we were having a conversation. I told him in the exactly same thing. I said, you know, you keep asking me all these questions and I keep going all over the way. And he says, yes, conversations should be going all over the way, like a love letter that makes no sense. So, you know, that is right. In a sense, conversations are love letters to our community, so they should meander. I
yeah,
don't
and
know.
conversations can probably end up in tiger emojis, who knows?
Sure, yeah.
Right.
All right. Sinthujan, is there anything else that you want to talk about? As I said, I'm happy to
Yes.
keep going. Yes, please.
Actually, one thing, the ocean. Wait, you know, no one talks about Kachadiva Island. You know, like, you know, Kachadiva Island.
Yeah.
And I'm always like, I find it such it's an island, for people who don't know. It's an island between Tamil Nadu and Jaffna, really, and an island that for some point was regulated by India, then by Sri Lanka. You know, I mean, through the British colonial period, also like pushed back and forth. You know, and then at the end of it, I think there were disputes, and at some point, wait, did India give it to Sri Lanka? Or did Sri Lanka? Indira Gandhi gave it to Sri Lanka, I think, right? Or was it the other way around? I'm not
Let me.
sure anymore.
Somebody gave it, but also it has a longer colonial history
It
where
does.
the British took over. It has these interesting mythological stories and ghost
Mhm.
stories. It
Eh,
also and I think somebody tried doing like a fashion, like a Vogue fashion shoot, and they got. I'm not kidding. This someone.
Arrested?
Yeah, they actually tried to do this very voguish, fashion shoot,
Hmm.
and it got a lot of negative feedback because not understanding how this very specific geography. I could be mistaken, but no, no, please,
I
we'll
mean,
talk about this.
Kachati was like, I mean, it's interesting because it connects fishing communities on both sides of the shores,
Mm-hmm,
right? And fishing communities, there's a Catholic church there,
mm-hmm,
which and has an annual pilgrimage, right? Where then fishing communities go from both sides of the shore to pray, and a lot of them go there to actually dry their fishing nets. And I always find it so interesting because in many ways these communities are so related, but by matter of fact of having the Indian state and the Sri Lankan state in between them, like Delhi and Colombo, between these people who are just few miles apart from each other, they become a different people. And when you think about how now conflicts arise between fishermen on both sides, you realize that they think about each other as antagonizing forces. And they think about each other. It's almost like I find it quite interesting because fishing communities in Ulam, they think about the Sri Lankan army, navy's violence towards Tamil Nadu fishermen as a way of almost safeguarding their own kind of like fishing grounds, even though that same army, like occupies them, militarizes them, oppresses them, but also like limits their own movements. They're the ones who bring in singular fishermen from the south who are able to settle there and then use like high-speed boats and go further down the ocean, which Tamil fishermen are not allowed to. And then you have like people from Tamil Nadu with their big fishing trails coming, like into like so-called Sri Lankan waters, trying to, empty them, and then being in conflict with both the Sri Lankan state, but also the Ulam Tamil fishing community, which has been put at a disadvantage because of decades of conflict and having their boats confiscated or destroyed and not having that technology to begin with. And I find it quite interesting because at some point you have these two communities who are so intertwined historically become such antagonizing competing forces based on policies and a narrative set by two other people. And there was a very good movie with Nandita Das, I forgot the name, something Parave, I forgot it, but it was about a fishing community in Rameshwaram, and she was the wife of a fisherman who was shot and killed by the Sri Lankan Navy, and years before they adopted a Tamil refugee whose parents were shot by the Sri Lankan Navy. And then it was a question of caste, because it was one of the few movies which was shot from a Christian point of view, also having a prominent role of the Muslim community who were the boat builders, like a very non-Hindu Tamil film, But then also it talked about whether that orphaned, like child of Ula Tamil refugees, whether he has the right to become a fisherman, because it is not clear whether he is historically part of a fishing community over there.
mm-hmm.
And then there was this very beautiful scene where they talk about the ocean, like the children from this side of the ocean, the children from that side of the ocean, we're all the same. And I'm just like, why do these movies and these narratives not get more importance, and why do
uh,
we yeah
no, but Kachetiva is now it's been the communities have been completely wiped out. There's no one there now. It's now just empty, right? It's
No, yeah, but
administrative.
I don't mean like Kachadiva anymore. I mean like people
Oh,
from
okay, okay,
Rameswaram and from Jaffna and Mannar, right? Like
right.
who have such close historical ties, but now we just see them like people in Tamil Nadu look further towards Chennai or Bangalore or like Mumbai or Delhi, and people in Jaffna being forced to look towards Colombo. So it's almost
Mm-hmm.
like by matter of infrastructural and political and economic decisions, even that, like the view of being able to look at each other is being changed in direction.
Yeah.
And that I found quite tragic from a pan Tamil perspective, because I'm just like, wow, it's just miles apart, and yet we're, like we're separating further and further. almost as if we're dealing with a completely different people.
And what you said is also something that you will hear Palestinians and Kashmiris now say, because increasingly in Kashmiris will say that we've become a question of a conversation between two nation states and not about Kashmiris. And almost all Kashmiris of a certain age who you talk to will talk of a relationship to Lahore, a relationship towards looking towards Iran, and then looking down towards those connections, and that connection is also now um, disrupted but also amputated. That's what they've done, right? They've amputated historical memories and other things. No, this is great. I actually, I think Kachetivu was given to Sri Lanka in, I think, 1970s by Indira Gandhi, I think, as a part of two nation states. At this point in time, I don't even know what to say. Suchi, should we kind of bring this to a close? Any concluding remarks?
Yes, I think thank you both so much. What a fantastic conversation this has been. And I think there is much to take away from today's conversation, especially for image makers or especially for anyone who, works with images. Primarily because it's so easy for us today to just, go ahead, make a picture, share it on social media without really understanding a lot of history and context. So, thank you both so much for really taking us through a lot of points that I think. I'm hoping also that people will buy Suchitra's book and we will revisit some of these conversations through that. So thank you, everyone who joined in this evening. And I don't know if Vasant is still here. Maybe not. I think he's left. He was here. I wanted to also thank him for supporting a lot of these conversations. And just for everybody to know that there are some reviews that we are also doing with ASAP Connect app. So after each talk, you can go download the app. It's an excellent app for conversations from the visual arts in the South Asian photo scene. And you will find some interesting interviews with Sinthujan, Suchitra, Ritesh, all over there. So do go check it out. Thank you once again. See you next Thursday with Suchitra and some more interesting conversations. Thank you.
Sinthujan, thank you so much for your work. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. We are both doing it. Thank you, everyone. Sinthujan, there are two interesting questions that came in. I know we didn't put it to you, but I'm just going to pass it on to you via email if you want to take a look at it.
Share it via email.
Sure, go for it.
I'll just send these questions. This is from Sagarika Huck, and I'll just send it to you through email. So in case you want to take a look at it. Again, thank you so much. Thanks for the time. And Suchi, thank you for putting all of us together.
Of course. It's been
Take
fun.
care. Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Stay safe, everyone.